Então, querido Andy, please, you can start your presentation. I don't know if you have you understood the introduction?
Yeah, I think my Portuguese is just good enough for me to understand and I thank you very much for it. Very kind. Very nice to speak to everyone today. As you heard, and I apologize for speaking in English, by the way. I hope you can understand. I will speak slowly. I hope the connection is okay. Tell me if there's any problem with the connection, and I will repeat some things. So as you've heard, I started off as a medical doctor in family medicine, but I've now moved into environmental health, and particularly these broad concepts of planetary health, the interaction between human health and natural systems, and specifically climate change as one of the major threats to the future of the health of humanity. And I'm going to base my remarks on this commission on planetary health, which I chaired in 2015. I think many of the concepts are still accurate, even if some of the data has changed. And then a book I wrote a couple of years ago with my friend and colleague, Howie Frumkin, bringing more up to date some of these ideas. So let me start with this slide. And I don't expect you to read the detail, but please just look at the patterns. On the left side, you can see the trends, the socioeconomic trends across the world, across our small planet. And you can see how world population increased dramatically, particularly since the middle of the last century. The world economy grew, GDP, gross domestic product. There was an increase in primary energy use. Fertilizer consumption increased because of the need to grow more food for the increasing world population. And many other changes had occurred. So there were big advances in human health, about 20 years additional life expectancy since the middle of the last century. The number of people living in absolute poverty declined. Of course, still too many inequalities and still too much poverty in the world and suffering, but there were real advances. But unfortunately, these advances, this human progress, came at a cost. And the cost was borne by the Earth systems, which you can see on the right here. So these trends, these changes were called the Great Acceleration, because you could see the trends accelerating from the middle of the last century. And you can also see how the Earth system impacts accelerating since the middle of the last century. You see the accumulation of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane in the atmosphere, causing climate change, increasing surface temperature, which I'll come on to in a moment, of the surface temperature of the planet. Sorry about that. And many other changes as well. Loading of the oceans with acid, increasing the acid oceans, degradation of the biosphere, loss of tropical forests, and so on. So these big changes in the Earth systems will have major implications for human health, and they can undermine the progress that we've seen to date in human health. And this is the most recent report, just come out in the last couple of days, on the planetary boundaries. Now, this concept of planetary boundaries is a very important one, and we used it to frame our thinking in the Planetary Health Commission of 2015. And this science is advancing all the time. So according to this analysis by Johan Rockstrom, Catherine Richardson, and others published in the last few days, these 9 planetary boundaries, which are shown on the slide, 6 of them are now being exceeded. So climate change, of course, is one. The levels of carbon dioxide, the most important greenhouse gas. The total, what's called the forcing of the climate. So that's the impact of these greenhouse gases on temperature. The fact that we're putting a lot of what they call novel entities or pollutants into the environment, tens of thousands of new compounds, many of which we don't fully understand. Phosphorus and nitrogen is leaking from the land into the oceans, into rivers, and it's causing dramatic changes in ecosystems. We're depleting fresh water. both the water that comes from rainfall, but also the groundwater that we use to irrigate the land. We're deforesting tropical landscapes in particular to grow more food or to harvest timber, and we're damaging the biosphere. So we're seeing dramatic declines in species, in numbers, in complexity, in the functional ability of ecosystems. And all of these combinations, of course, interact, and they have very, very negative implications for human health, but we don't fully understand them, of course. We're still trying to understand the complex implications for human health. But let me say a few words about some of the things that we do understand. One, of course, is extreme heat. And on the left side of this slide, you can see the red line is the global average temperature, and the orange line is what it would be if we didn't have human-induced climate change, which is due to the burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, and other factors as well, due to human activities. And you can see that the average temperature is over 1.1 degrees higher. It increases more over land, over the oceans, than over the oceans. And some parts of the world heat up faster than others. For example, the Arctic is heating up faster than other parts of the world. And we're seeing melting of ice caps and so on. And we now know that health is being affected in many parts of the planet. Not just in low-income countries, also in high-income countries. We're seeing in wildfires in North America, for example. And we also can begin to attribute, through improved science, we can say that some of these deaths wouldn't have occurred in the absence of human-induced climate change. And one example is a recent paper which showed that more than 1/3 of total heat deaths over recent decades can be attributed to human-induced climate change. And you can see from the map on the right, that data comes from sites in 43 countries, but there are big gaps. So much of Africa and Asia, we don't really know what's happening. So these estimates are probably underestimates. Now, these are, of course, not chronic disease, they're acute deaths, but we do know that some chronic diseases like diabetes increase the risks of extreme heat exposure. So there's an interaction between these acute exposures and chronic disease. This infographic tries to summarize the complex exposure pathways by which climate change can impact human health. You can see at the top is the greenhouse gas emissions, changing the climate, and through a range of demographic, socioeconomic, and other environmental factors, these affect the magnitude and the pattern of risks. So where you live in the world, the background level of poverty, for example, your baseline air and water quality. And then through a range of exposure pathways, climate change can influence these risks. The obvious things like extreme weather events, floods and droughts, for example, heat stress, as I mentioned, the increasing difficulty of working as the temperatures increase. So people, particularly those working in the open air, they can't air condition their work environment, find it more difficult to work, and that drives more people back into poverty. Air quality, we know that there's increasing pollen, for example. Some types of pollen are increasing. Wildfires, which I'll mention in a moment. Water quality and quantity, food supply and safety, and of course the distribution of many vector-borne diseases. And then lastly, and very importantly, but difficult to quantify, the effects on poverty, on conflict, on migration, and so on. So you can see that there are many pathways by which climate change can affect health. And this is not an exhaustive list. There are other things as well, like zoonotic diseases and so on. I don't have time to speak about very much. And you can see that many of the impacts are concentrated in low and middle income countries, but all parts of the world, as I say, are experiencing effects. And somewhat to our surprise, some high-income countries like Canada, for example, North America, are seeing terrible wildfires. And some of the effects are shown in this slide. We know that wildfire particles are smaller than those in particulate matter from urban sources. They have a higher proportion of PM2.5, very small particles, of course. They're probably more damaging. They contain more oxidative and pro-inflammatory components. And the slide shows you the increase in all-cause mortality following exposure to wildfires, cardiovascular mortality, so probably people with pre-existing cardiovascular disease are more susceptible, respiratory mortality, so people with pre-existing chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, for example, are likely to be more susceptible to wildfire smoke. And the map just shows you where there have been different levels of wildfire-related PM 2.5, fine particle air pollution. And you can see, again, there are gaps in monitoring around the world, but some of these sites have extraordinarily high levels of air pollution, over 200 micrograms per cubic meter. And remember, at the moment, probably where you are, I would guess you're probably breathing about air that probably contains around 20 micrograms. I don't know exactly. I'm probably breathing air that contains about 12 micrograms per cubic meter, something like that. But even at those low levels, there are increased risks. And in fact, the risks increase very rapidly, not just for wildfire-related air pollution, but for all types of fine particle air pollution as the level goes, the concentration goes up. But we also know that the environmental change affects food systems through the growth of crops. And this is a systematic review that we did a few years ago, led by my colleague Pauline Shieldbeek. And that showed how, in this case, some vegetable and legumes like beans, peas, and so on, other legumes, very important for nutrition. Their growth is stimulated to some extent by carbon dioxide. Well, you might think, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? Well, maybe, but the problem is, as you stimulate the growth of some of these crops, it also reduces the level of micronutrients, so zinc and iron, for example. And we know that micronutrient deficiency affects perhaps 2 billion people around the world. So this could reduce the availability of micronutrients to many people. But overall, environmental change has big negative effects. If we look at the effects of water availability, which may be affected by climate change, of course, big negative effects. Effects of temperature, big negative effects, not just at 4 degrees shown here, but also quite modest increases in temperature can really decrease yields. And ozone, which is, of course, a powerful greenhouse gas in its own right. And environmental change is increasing ozone, for example, because of methane. Methane is a precursor of ozone. So that also reduces crop yield. So the general effects are negative. And that will affect, of course, the availability of nutritious food around the world. It isn't just climate change as well, biodiversity loss, for example, through the reduction in pollinators. So pollinators like bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, you can see here. As the pollinators decline, that reduces the pollination of food-related crops. And this is work not done by us, but by Sam Myers' group at Harvard a few years ago. They showed how that would increase the risk of non-communicable diseases, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and diabetes, which you can see on the map, but also undernutrition and communicable disease as well, the lower part of the map. So the decline in these crops that require pollinators, which are declining for reasons of climate change, loss of natural habitat, increasing use of pesticides, and so on. This could have big public health implications. But the food system isn't the only mechanism, or the air pollution is not the only mechanism for the effects on chronic diseases. We also see in some parts of the world, with the salination of drinking water in countries like Bangladesh, for example, there's an unusually high incidence of preeclampsia in pregnant women in coastal regions, and a significant association with drinking water sodium, as our colleagues in Bangladesh showed some years ago. And you can also document when you change the level of saline in the water, for example, as you move into the rainy season, then blood pressure parallels that level of salinity. And it also increases the risk, the odds of hypertension in non-pregnant individuals as well, as shown on this slide. So as sea level rises, more saline, more salt gets into the coastal aquifers, then that can increase the exposure of these populations to very high levels of saline in their drinking water. And this is a combination of local changes like damming of rivers, for example, with global changes like sea level rise. Now, it's not just physical effects, of course, it also, there are effects on mental health. And we're now beginning to understand the effects, and they can be quite long term. For example, when populations are exposed to floods, droughts, wildfires, they're experiencing high levels of chronic mental disorder, common disorders like depression and anxiety. We also are becoming aware of this concept of solastalgia. Solastalgia is the distress caused by environmental change. So, for example, when communities have to move, because of an extreme event, because of a flood, for example, or because of melting ice in the Arctic, then they experience these feelings of distress, of environmentally related distress. And we also know that climate anxiety is quite prevalent in young people. And this survey shown on the right side of the slide shows you that a high proportion of young people, including in countries like Brazil, are extremely or very worried about climate change. And on a global scale, nearly half of them said that they were so worried about climate change that it was having an impact on their functioning. They also said, in response to this survey, not shown on the slide, but it's in the survey results, that they had very little faith in political leaders to address these problems in sufficient time with sufficient ambition. So there's a loss of faith amongst young people in political leadership to address these problems. So let me, in the second part of my talk, move on to what we need to do about this, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that nothing can be done. Of course, a great deal can be done and must be done very quickly. And there are two things that we can do. One is we can adapt to the changes that we can't prevent, because we're already over 1.1 degrees. We can't prevent it all. We're probably not going to keep temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. Sadly, that opportunity is missing. It's been lost. We may be able to keep under 2 degrees global average, which means in some parts of the world much higher than 2 degrees, but we need to act very quickly. So we will need to adapt to climate change, whether we like it or not. We can adapt by better disaster management, better flood protection, more resilient, climate resilient healthcare systems, which are able to sustain population health in the face of these environmental shocks. So there's quite a lot we can do. Better early warning systems for health, heat health, early warning systems for disease like dengue, for example, or malaria in some regions. But we have to mitigate, and mitigation in climate terms means cutting emissions that cause climate change. And that means moving towards sustainable transportation, stopping our dependence on fossil fuel-powered private vehicles in particular, clean energy, energy efficiency, more sustainable diets, because we know that agriculture and food are responsible for about 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane that comes from ruminants, cattle, for example. So we have to make these really quite major transformations in our society. We know quite a lot of what to do, although there are big gaps, as shown on this slide. A recent review done also by my colleague Pauline Shielbeek showed only 2 well-designed studies of climate change adaptation strategies and their impact on public health, having reviewed over 1,500 papers. So we know to some extent what we have to do, but there's still big gaps in the evidence. But mitigation is crucial. And I suppose the good news about mitigation is that when we cut greenhouse gas emissions, we can also benefit human health in the near term, not just by reducing the risks of dangerous climate change, but also, for example, by reducing air pollution, which kills, according to WHO, about 7 million people a year. And the slide on the left part of this slide shows you what people die of. And as you can see, about a third of these deaths are from ischemic heart disease, various manifestations of ischemic heart disease, about 20% from stroke, just over 20% from pneumonia, nearly 20% from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and probably about 7% from lung cancer as well, because air pollution has been linked to lung cancer. Not as important as tobacco, of course, but it does contribute to lung cancer. Now, we also know that there's growing evidence that even low levels of air pollution are important. So there's no kind of safe level. And that's been reflected in the new WHO air quality guidelines, which are lower than they were 15 years ago, as you can see from the slide. And it compares the previous guideline levels with the 2021 guideline levels. And you can see that for many of these, fine particulate matter, for example, nitrogen dioxide, the levels are substantially lower. And so that means that we need to have much more ambition. But it also means that we'll have bigger benefits as we reduce exposure to air pollution, both household air pollution, but particularly, of course, burning fossil fuels, it's ambient outdoor air pollution as well. And this slide is taken from a study we did with our colleagues in Germany, Jos Lelyveld and colleagues a few years ago, trying to estimate the number of deaths due to fossil fuel related air pollution, because not all air pollution comes from fossil fuels, but a lot of it does. And this study showed about 3.6 million deaths based on 2015 data. We're updating that data at the moment, and the numbers, I can't share the numbers with you because they haven't been published yet, but they will be larger numbers than before because of changing evidence about the low levels of the effects of low levels of air pollution. You can see where those deaths occur: India, China, Europe, North America. Some also you can see in Brazil, particularly in southern Brazil as well. Not so much in Africa because people don't burn so many fossil fuels. But if people develop along a high fossil fuel burning trajectory of development, then of course there'll be more deaths from fossil fuels. Many of those from coal burning, but also of course oil and to some extent gas as well, particularly around nitrogen dioxide, which is not shown so much in this slide. But here's a slide showing you nitrogen dioxide. And the nitrogen dioxide, we believe, increases the risk of asthma. And this is showing you the number of deaths in young people. Sorry, not number of deaths, but the incident cases of asthma in young people and adolescents from nitrogen dioxide air pollution, based on a study we did also with the Lelleveld group a couple of years ago. About 3.5 million cases of asthma we thought could be attributed to nitrogen dioxide. Much of this comes from fossil fuel use in land transportation, power generation, and to some extent solid biofuels in households as well. And you can see that Brazil has quite a high level. It has a high background level of asthma in young people, and roughly 14% of that in Brazil as well is contributed, we estimated, from nitrogen dioxide. But there are also other benefits from addressing transport systems, not just air pollution, also physical activity. And we and others have done studies in cities like Delhi, Sao Paulo, with Brazilian colleagues, London and England and Wales more generally, looking at the health benefits of active travel, by which we mean walking and cycling, but also increased use of public transport and getting people less to use their private cars less. And that causes quite big health benefits in these different environments. The amounts of the actual disease burden averted depends very much on where you are and what kind of assumptions you make, but they're substantial benefits. A lot of them, some of them are due to air pollution reductions, but quite a lot due to physical activity. Of course, there can be an increased risk of road injuries, but it depends how you design the action. So if you separate, for example, cycles from motor vehicles, then you can reduce the risks, of course. And the bottom part of the slide just shows you the benefits to our National Health Service in England and Wales. If we could, this is in economic terms, if we could reduce some of the use of the healthcare system by reforming our transport system and getting people in England and Wales, urban England and Wales, to walk and cycle like the population of Copenhagen in Denmark, which you may know has very high levels of walking and cycling. And so we estimated big potential benefits from reduced diabetes, dementia, heart disease, stroke, and some types of cancer as well. And these accelerate over time because there's a lag. For some of them, like cancer, for example, it takes quite a long time to get the benefits. There are other studies looking at the neighborhood walkability. This work was done in Canada, looking at the relationship between neighborhood walkability with change in overweight, obesity, and diabetes over time. And what it shows you on the left there is that those people living in the most walkable neighborhoods in the urban population in Ontario had much lower levels of diabetes. And that's because if you make the places that people want to access, like shops, health centers, schools, if you make them easily accessible by walking, then people will walk there. And this shows you the health benefits of doing that. We don't know yet the effects of electric vehicles. We believe they'll probably be broadly beneficial because they're not emitting so much. They don't emit any pollutants from the tailpipe, so fine particles and nitrogen dioxide. But of course, the electricity has to be generated, so you have to generate it from clean resource sources. And it also depends on the particles that come from the tires and the brakes. And there's still a lot of debate at the moment about what the importance of those particles. and whether they will decrease with electric vehicles. There's some studies suggesting they will because of the use of regenerative braking, but electric vehicles can also be very heavy, and so they can increase tire wear. So a lot of work going on at the moment to try and understand the health implications of electric vehicles. And then moving on to green space, we know that being exposed to green space is good for your health. It can also help to cool cities, so it's an adaptation strategy. But it may also help to reduce the risk of the use of air conditioning, and air conditioning is has a big drain on energy. So it may also help to reduce the energy demands and therefore help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we can put enough green space in cities to help cool cities. And this is also taken from Canada, and it shows you the decreased death rates associated with exposure to greenness. And you can see that, you know, if greenness is a lot of green space within 250 meters of the home, then there's big reductions in cardiovascular disease, respiratory mortality as well. This slide also shows increased protection for those of higher income, and that may be because the quality of green space in more deprived areas is not so good. So we have to be careful that these actions don't increase inequalities. The food system, I don't have time to talk very much about the food system, but just very briefly, there's a lot of food waste, of course, about 30% of food is wasted. We know that many healthy diets, if you follow WHO dietary recommendations, that in many countries would reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well as benefiting health, and also reduces the amount of land needed because, for example, we don't need as much land to grow crops to feed livestock, for example. Vegetarian diets have greater benefits, but of course it's difficult for cultural reasons to get people to eat vegetarian food, at least in many countries, not in some countries like India, but many other countries. But even moving towards healthy diets with more consumption of fruit and vegetables and less consumption of red and processed meat is a good thing for the environment and for health. And this is the famous Eat Lancet Commission that I wasn't involved with at all, but I think it's a very interesting report. And they modeled the effect of what they called a planetary health diet, which is a diet in which we consume lots of fruit and vegetables. As you can see, over 400 grams a day, 500 grams or perhaps more of fruit and vegetables, whole grain carbohydrates, much lower levels of red meat and dairy products than many countries consume, and more nuts and seeds as well. And they suggested that if we could do that with the whole world population, which would obviously be difficult to do, but it was a thought experiment really, that you could reduce greenhouse gas emissions, keep the planet within planetary boundaries from the food system, and reduce premature deaths by very large numbers, by many millions over coming decades. So big potential benefits. I mean, the challenge is, of course, how to implement that change. So in conclusion, let me just summarize that to say that we are exceeding the planetary boundaries on the small planet in which we live. This threatens to undermine the progress that we've seen in health, and I think we're witnessing the effects of climate and many other environmental changes on the health of populations around the world. But the good news is that many of the policies that we need to put into place, we need to implement to reduce these environmental impacts, can also benefit our health, not just by reducing the risks of dangerous climate change or biodiversity loss caused by land use change, but also by these what are called co-benefits or ancillary benefits from reduced air pollution, improved diets, and increased physical activity. And this concluding slide summarizes a modeling study of 9 countries, including Brazil, but other countries as well, which showed that by 2040, if these countries implemented nationally determined contributions, that's NDCs, these are the contributions that each country makes under the Paris Climate Agreement. If they put these policies, if they put this health dimension at the center of new climate policies to meet the Paris Agreement targets, these could reduce air pollution, diet-related and physical inactivity-related deaths by many millions in total. You can't just add them together because they do affect the same outcomes, but even if you take that into account, there's still many millions of deaths that could be prevented by implementing these policies just in these 9 countries that they studied. So you can see that there are big win-win strategies for human health and for the planet. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Andy. This is a very comprehensive presentation, although short, but very comprehensive and dramatic. On the one side, because it shows the dramatic negative impacts of all these climate change and all the other important things that are happening with the planet, but also on the other side, the impact of the actions we can take, the positive impact is also dramatic. And this is the good news that we can do. There are so many things that we can do. Yeah. And the range of actions is very broad, so we can do many things. One thing that I would want to share with you, Andy, is that right now here in Rio Grande do Sul, we are going through a real example, a very dramatic example. We're going through a period of excessive rains and floods in our state. Yeah. And so we have a big emergency, a human and public health, and it's a big thing that's happening here. A lot of people are going to these places, to volunteers, to help in the material needs of the people, and also health needs, and mental health is very dramatic too. Yeah. So I think it's very clear that we have a very dramatic situation to deal with. Yeah. But what I wanted to ask you, Andy, is, well, I think that one of the biggest problems that we have is that still, for most of the people, when we see this, all these data and all this situation about planetary health, is that still, for most of the people, it's distant from our own lives. It's like, this is a problem of the other people. This is not reaching me. So I think this is one of the things that I would want to ask you. How can we really create this sense of belonging to this? This is my problem. This is not somebody else's problem. This is my problem, and I have to do something about it, whatever is within my scope of doing something. So this is one question that I want to ask you.
Thank you so much, Camila. Yeah, I mean, this is something which obviously concerns me a great deal. And we have to be careful that we don't put all the responsibility onto individuals, because many of these issues are systems problems, you know, and they are due to the fact that we live in a system where we don't pay the full economic costs of burning fossil fuels, for example, or the full economic cost of eating a high meat diet, for example. So part of the problem is the economic system drives us towards more destruction of nature. And so we have to be careful not to say to our individual patients, you know, it's you're causing this. I would put it the other way around and say, you know, there's a great opportunity for you to benefit your health, but at the same time, that will bring some benefits to the planet as well. Because I think that many people can't really relate to environmental change. It's too, as you say, it's too distant. It doesn't really, they may be concerned about the environment theoretically, but in real terms, it doesn't motivate change. But many people are concerned about their health and the health of their loved ones and the health of future generations. So I think this is why the voice of the health professionals is so important. And engaging in a constructive way, sometimes that can be done with individual patients, sometimes it can be done with our hospital or clinic, helping them to decarbonize their supply chains, which I didn't have time to talk about, but it's an interesting challenge in its own right. But sometimes it means working with others in other sectors. So, for example, working with the city administration to advise on clean transport systems, or more flood-resilient infrastructure, or better early warning systems that can give early warning to populations about floods, heat waves, and so on. So I think there's many ways in which we can work, from the individual level to the collective level in our day-to-day work as health professionals, but also working with other sectors and other disciplines on a city level, a state level or even a national level?
Yes, thank you. It's really important that we have at the systemic level, these changes that are political, economical, so that people have a real chance to choose sometimes what they are going to eat or how they're going to move around, because many times this is not a choice for most of the people. They don't have the conditions to live decently. We have been talking a lot about social determinants of health here in this conference, and inequalities, inequities. So I think this is all the same big issue. Somebody would like to make a question? Pessoal, tá dando para entender o inglês. We are trying. E fazer alguma pergunta. Ainda temos tempo, se alguém quiser fazer alguma pergunta, temos uns 5 minutos. Sim. Andy, we have a question from the audience.
Good morning, Professor Haines. It's a pleasure to hear you. I'm Paula Diaz from the University of Antioquia in Colombia. Thank you for your inspiring talk. I was wondering, as a public health worker and surveillance health people, how can we really do more to prevent this climate change? How can do more for the new generation of people that are growing up with this pain, the pain of our health, our whole world? And how maybe we could do really new action to hope for these new generations? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And of course, it is the big question that confronts all of us, really, how we can mobilize people in a positive way for action, particularly, of course, young people. And my experience is that young people are so particularly concerned. Unfortunately, middle-aged and older people tend to be less concerned. So I do think working with youth is really important because they can influence their parents and their grandparents so much. I think having a positive message, even if we can see the negative impacts all around us, and you're experiencing in Rio Grande do Sul, I know you're experiencing the floods, which we just heard about. But although we're experiencing many negative impacts, it's very important also to keep, I think, this positive message. Because what we do know about human behavior is that just telling people that things are very bad will not necessarily motivate change. Whereas if we can prevent people with healthy alternatives, then that can, we hope, be a motivator for change. So I think public health professionals really have the opportunity to work with local communities, as I say, to help them to adapt to climate change as much as possible by better surveillance, better early warning, and so on. And working with other sectors to increase the resilience of city infrastructure, for example, to work with urban decision makers to ensure that urban planning takes into account both health and the environment. So I think there's a tremendous role for the public health community, working with clinical colleagues as well, of course, to inform decision makers, to try to motivate them for action, but also to reach out to the general public. So get on the radio, get on the local TV, talk about these issues, but not just in a negative way, but also saying what we can do about them in an attempt to really motivate the kind of changes that we need. Because politicians, I'm afraid, are not going to lead us out of this. Because some of the decisions that have to be made, in many cases, could be a little bit unpopular. We see here in the UK, for example, attempts to restrict people from using their cars, for example, or drive less polluting cars. This sometimes gets public opposition. But I think part of the problem for that is that the public has not been educated properly, has not been informed properly about why this is important. And also, too much burden has been placed on the poor. It's not the poor that are responsible for climate change. It's often the high consuming. The top 1% of the world's population contributes 17% of greenhouse gas emissions. The bottom 50% contributes very little. The bottom 10% contributes virtually nothing. So we need to try to ensure that the policies that are put in place don't disadvantage the poor. And I think it's really important for the public health community to articulate this clear vision of a healthy and environmentally sustainable future, which is, in reach. We do know quite a lot about what we have to do, but we're not doing it. So the voice of the public health community and the clinical colleagues is so important, I think, in shifting this kind of discourse, shifting this discussion onto a more positive discussion. Thank you.
Yes, just to add to your questions, one of the things that we can do also is to introduce this theme in our in the training of students in the health area. For example, in our medical school, we are introducing, I think 1 or 2 years ago, we started with planetary health in one of our disciplines. So this is one thing that we can do to involve more the youth and the people who are going to be the future practitioners and future public health officers. We are very hopeful with this kind of thing, but of course it's very small. It's a very small action, but it's something we believe that is very important to do.
And can I just add, Camila, that we're now seeing many professional organizations, medical professional organizations, speaking out about climate change. So many of the kind of leading organizations around the world, including the World Medical Association, many national associations, the World Organization of Family Doctors, as you well know, is very, very active in the field of planetary health and climate change. So many of our professional organizations are really speaking out on this issue. And I think, to me, that's very, very encouraging. So I would also encourage you to work with your local and national professional organizations to make sure that they're really emphasizing the importance of planetary health and climate change.
Yeah. Well, each one of us can be a spreader of this word, right? And do a small action within our scope and spread it to the other networks that we have. Thank you very much, Andy, once more for your contribution. Wonderful to be with you again. Sorry you're not seeing us. You're not seeing us, right?
Well, I can see some of you. So yeah, and I know I can see there's a lot of people in the room, and I'm grateful to you for listening. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, I hope next time we can be together in Brazil or somewhere else. But it was very nice that you could participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.